The night air in Portage County, Ohio, on April 17, 1966, was cold and still, thick with the damp scent of thawing earth and the lingering chill of a winter that refused to surrender. It was a landscape of profound quiet, a place where the world felt ancient and asleep, stitched together by miles of dark two-lane asphalt that unspooled between sleeping farmhouses and skeletal stands of oak and maple. Just before 5 a.m., the universe was a simple equation of darkness and the lonely hum of a V8 engine. Deputy Sheriff Dale Spar was at the end of his shift, his mind adrift of fatigue and routine thoughts. Paperwork, the lukewarm coffee waiting at the station, the welcome prospect of his own bed. His cruiser, a symbol of order and predictability, cut a solitary path through the immense silent blackness of Route 224. A ribbon of civilization laid thinly over a wilder, older world. It was in this moment of absolute normalcy, this crucible of the mundane, that the universe decided to rewrite its rules. It began not with a bang, but with a flicker of impossible light. At first, it was just a car, or so he thought, abandoned on the side of the road near a desolate power substation. Its lights were on, piercing the gloom. A routine check. Spore slowed his vehicle, his training kicking in, pushing aside the heavy blanket of exhaustion. He radioed his position, his voice calm, professional, a small point of human order in the vast pre-dawn emptiness. But as he drew closer, the scene began to unravel. The light wasn't coming from a car. It was coming from the woods behind the vehicle. It was a glow that seemed to breathe, to pulse with a life of its own, illuminating the bare trees in a spectral, silvery luminescence. It was a light that made no sound, a silent fire consuming the darkness. Spar stopped his cruiser, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cold. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart. The light grew, ascending from the tree line, a colossal, luminous object rising into the sky with the eerie grace of a dream. It was shaped like an inverted ice cream cone, or perhaps a flattened metallic top, glowing with an intensity that dwarfed the moon. It was utterly, profoundly silent. There was no roar of engines, no whine of machinery, just a vast, hovering presence that defied every known law of physics and common sense. In that instant, Dale Spar, a man of rules and regulations, a man who dealt in the tangible evidence of DUIs and breaking and entering, was confronted with the absolute, undeniable reality of the impossible. His world, once a grid of roads and statutes, had become a canvas for something utterly alien. What does a man do when the sky itself breaks its own laws? What does a lawman do when he witnesses a phenomenon for which no law has ever been written? He did the only thing he could. He got back in his car, his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed the radio microphone, and he gave chase. The object began to move, gliding eastward along the highway, maintaining a steady altitude of 1,000 feet. It moved not with the brutal thrust of a jet, but with a fluid, effortless momentum, like a thought traversing the night sky. Spar slammed his foot on the accelerator, his cruiser's engine roaring to life, a frantic mechanical cry against the object's unnerving silence. The chase had begun. A lone police car, a symbol of terrestrial authority, hurtling down a dark country road in pursuit of an enigma. He was pushing 80 miles per hour, then 90, the familiar landscape blurring into a meaningless smear of dark shapes. But he wasn't gaining. The object paced him, effortlessly, as if toying with him, a celestial predator playing with its earthbound prey. His voice crackled over the radio, no longer the calm professional, but a man wrestling with the raw, visceral shock of his senses. He was describing the indescribable, trying to force the square peg of this experience into the round hole of his vocabulary. It was bright, it was huge, it was silent, and it was real. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was a lifeline to sanity, a voice from the world that still made sense, a world where things didn't just appear out of the woods and float silently through the sky. But that world was receding in his rearview mirror with every passing second. Ahead of him, there was only the light, a beacon of profound mystery pulling him deeper into the unknown, down a highway that no longer led to the familiar towns of Ohio, but to the very edge of human understanding. The questions burned in his mind, hotter than the straining engine of his car. What was it? Where did it come from? And, most terrifyingly, what did it want? The answer, he feared, was not something that could be found in any police manual. He was alone, a single point of bewildered consciousness racing toward a confrontation with the ultimate unknown, and the sun was still a long way from rising. The night and the mystery it held was far from over. To understand the profound impact of that chase, one must first understand the man behind the wheel. Deputy Dale Spar was not a fantasist. He was the bedrock of his community, a 34-year-old lawman with a reputation for being level-headed and dependable. A husband and father of two, his life was an anchor of responsibility, grounded in the tangible realities of small-town life in the American Midwest. He was a former Air Force aircraft mechanic, a man who understood the nuts and bolts of conventional aviation, who knew the distinct silhouettes of planes and helicopters, the familiar roar of a jet engine, the predictable arc of a meteor. His world was one of observable facts and mechanical certainties. He was, by all accounts, the last person on Earth who would invent a story about a flying saucer. And he was not alone in his character. His partner in the initial moments of this unfolding drama, though in a separate vehicle, was Officer Wilbur Barney Neff. Neff, arriving as Spor's backup, was another man of similar temperament, a policeman who trusted his eyes and his training above all else. These were not men given to hysteria or flights of fancy. They were the very fabric of local authority, the human embodiment of the thin blue line that separated order from chaos. And on that April morning, the chaos they confronted was not of this world. The setting itself was a character in this drama. Portage County in the 1960s was a patchwork of rural landscapes and burgeoning suburban towns, a place where the industrial might of nearby Akron and Cleveland bled into vast tracts of farmland and dense, untamed forests. It was a region steeped in a quiet, almost primal folklore. Locals spoke of strange lights in the sky long before the term flying saucer entered the popular lexicon. They told stories whispered over back fences and in late-night diners, tales of hovering illuminations over the vast reservoirs, of silent, fast-moving objects that would streak across the star-dusted canopy of the Ohio night. These were the kinds of stories that were part of the local color, dismissed by most as swamp gas, weather phenomena, or the product of an overactive imagination. Yet, they persisted. The area was a nexus of sorts, a place where the veil between the known and the unknown seemed unusually thin. Was it the geology of the land, the presence of major waterways like the Mahoning River, or some other unseen quality that made this stretch of Ohio a silent theater for such recurring, unexplained performances? The official record remained silent, but the unofficial history, the oral tradition of the people who lived on that land, suggested that what Dale Spar saw that morning was not an isolated incident, but the latest and most dramatic chapter in a long, secret history. This was the world Spar and Neff inhabited, a world of pragmatic duty overlaid upon a landscape that held its secrets close. When Spar first radioed for backup, his words were measured, but the bewilderment was unmistakable. He wasn't reporting a crime, he was reporting a violation of reality itself. When Officer Neff arrived, he found Spar's cruiser parked, its single occupant staring, mesmerized at the sky. Neff followed his gaze, and his own professionally cultivated composure shattered. There it was. Not a star, not a plane, not a helicopter. It was a tangible object, solid-looking despite its luminosity, hanging in the sky with an impossible stillness. It was, as Neff would later describe it, like a huge piece of construction equipment in the sky. The two officers, two pillars of rational authority, stood together on the cold shoulder of a country road, sharing an experience that had no precedent in their lives or their training. They were witnesses. But witnesses to what? They decided to pursue. It was an instinctual reaction, the response of men conditioned to investigate. The unusual, to run toward the problem, not away from it. The decision to engage, to chase this celestial anomaly, would propel them out of the quiet jurisdiction of Portage County and into the annals of UFO history. The object seemed to be waiting for them. As they scrambled back into their respective vehicles, the light moved, not with the panicked flight of something being pursued, but with a deliberate, almost intelligent grace. It drifted east, its altitude unwavering, its silence a deafening counterpoint to the frantic roar of their engines. The chase was on, but it was a chase on the object's terms. It was a shepherd guiding its flock, a silent instructor leading its students on a journey into the heart of the mystery. The world they were protecting, the world of speed limits and property lines, was about to become terrifyingly small, and the universe terrifyingly large and infinitely strange. Their pursuit was more than just a physical act of driving. It was an act of crossing a threshold, leaving behind the comfortable map of their known world for a territory that was utterly, frighteningly uncharted. They were no longer just police officers. They had become unwilling explorers, pioneers charting a course into a new and bewildering frontier, all before the first light of dawn. The radio became the nerve center of the anomaly, a frantic electronic web connecting islands of disbelief across eastern Ohio. Sparr's initial report, laced with a professional urgency that barely concealed his shock, had set in motion a chain reaction. The dispatcher, a voice of calm in the storm, became the central hub, patching in other departments as the chase began to bleed across jurisdictional lines. The first to join the chorus of confused voices was Officer Barney Neff, who, upon arriving at the scene, added his own stunned confirmation. "I see it too," his voice crackled, the simple phrase carrying the weight of profound validation. Sparr was not losing his mind. He was not hallucinating. What was happening was real. This confirmation was a crucial turning point. A single witness can be dismissed, his perception questioned, his sanity doubted. But two witnesses, both trained observers, both officers of the law, present a far more difficult problem for the official narrative of denial. As their two cruisers sped eastward on Route 224, the object above them seemed to respond to their pursuit with an intelligence that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It was not merely fleeing. At times, it would slow, allowing them to close the distance, its light intensifying, pulsing as if in communication. Then, as they drew nearer, it would accelerate with a burst of speed that was simply impossible, leaving them in its celestial dust, only to slow again miles down the road, waiting for them to catch up. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the roles were terrifyingly unclear. Who was the cat and who was the mouse? Were they chasing it, or was it leading them? The officers reported its movements with a running commentary of awe and frustration. It could make right-angle turns at incredible speeds without slowing down. It could stop on a dime and hover in complete silence. It moved with a freedom from inertia that suggested a technology far beyond anything known to man. It was, in Sparr's words, like a yo-yo on a string, dancing in the sky with a playful and yet menacing agility. As they blasted through the sleeping town of Ravenna, the chase was passed on to the next jurisdiction. The radio chatter grew, a tapestry of voices from different towns, different counties, all focused on the single unbelievable event unfolding in their skies. The dispatcher in Portage County contacted the police department in Salem, Ohio, farther to the east. The message was passed along, two officers in pursuit of an unidentified flying object heading their way. In Salem, Patrolman David Fitzpatrick, on his own lonely patrol, received the call. Skeptical but duty-bound, he drove to a vantage point and waited. He didn't have to wait long. He saw it too. A bright, metallic-looking object, just as Sparr and Neff had described. Another voice, another trained observer, was added to the chorus. The weight of the evidence was growing with every mile marker they passed. The chase was now a multi-jurisdictional event, a rolling convoy of terrestrial authority struggling to keep pace with a singular ethereal enigma. They were pushing their vehicles to their absolute limits, sirens occasionally wailing into the empty night, red and blue lights flashing uselessly at the silent, brilliant object above. The world outside their windshields was a hypnotic blur of dark trees and fleeting road signs. Inside the cars, the atmosphere was thick with adrenaline and a creeping existential dread. They were lawmen, armed with 38 revolvers and the authority of the state of Ohio. But what good were their weapons? What good was their authority? against a silent giant that could outrun their fastest cruisers and defy the very laws of gravity. They were utterly, hopelessly outmatched. With each passing mile, their sense of control, the very foundation of their profession, was eroding, replaced by a humbling awareness of their own technological impotence. They were like cavemen with spears, chasing a god across the plains. The object led them off Route 224 and onto Route 14, continuing its relentless eastward journey. They were heading toward the Pennsylvania border, leaving their home state, their jurisdiction, their entire frame of reference far behind. The radio calls became more desperate. They were requesting information from anyone, everyone. They contacted local airports. Were there any planes in the area? The answer was always no. They contacted nearby Air Force bases. Was the military running a drill? The answer was no. Every conventional explanation was systematically eliminated, leaving only the stark, unbelievable truth. They were chasing something that, according to the official world, did not exist, yet it hung there in the sky, a brilliant, undeniable fact, pulling them ever onward into the heart of the night. The pursuit had transcended a simple chase. It had become an 85-mile, 90-minute pilgrimage into the surreal. As the officers crossed the state line from Ohio into Pennsylvania, they were not just crossing a geographical boundary, but a psychological one. They were far from home, low on fuel, and running on pure adrenaline. The familiar comfort of their own jurisdictions was gone, replaced by the alien geography of another state. Yet, the object remained, a constant luminous companion leading them deeper into the unknown. The radio traffic was now a complex web of interstate communication. The Ohio State Highway Patrol, local Pennsylvania police departments, and dispatchers from multiple counties were all part of the unfolding drama. In Conway, Pennsylvania, a small borough nestled along the Ohio River, Police Chief Gerald Butert was awakened by a call. He listened, incredulous, as the dispatcher relayed the story of the Ohio officers in hot pursuit of a UFO, now entering his territory. Like the others before him, he was skeptical, but the urgency in the report was palpable. He got dressed and went to his own police car. Along with Officer Frank Panzanella, Butert drove to a high point overlooking the highway where the Ohio officers were expected to arrive. And there, just as the reports had claimed, they saw it. A large, intensely bright, oval-shaped object hanging silently in the sky. Chief Buchert's voice now joined the official record, adding the weight of his own authority to the growing mountain of testimony. He was a police chief. His confirmation lent a new level of credibility that was impossible to ignore. The convoy was growing. Spar and Neff, the original witnesses, were now joined in their perception, if not in the direct chase, by officers from multiple towns and 2 different states. The phenomenon was no longer the isolated experience of 1 or 2 men on a lonely road. It was a confirmed, multi-witness event observed by at least 7 police officers. As Spar and Neff's cruisers roared into Pennsylvania, their fuel gauges dipping dangerously into the red, the object began to change its behavior once more. The playful, evasive dance was over. The game of cat and mouse was reaching its conclusion. Near the town of Rochester, Pennsylvania, the object slowed, and then it stopped. It hovered, motionless, at an altitude of perhaps 500 feet. It was waiting for them. Spore pulled his cruiser to a halt directly beneath it. Neff pulled up alongside him. For the first time in over an hour, the engines were silent. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. They were no longer chasing. They had arrived. The climax of their impossible journey was upon them. The object hung above them, a silent, breathtaking spectacle. It was massive, far larger than they had initially estimated. They could now make out a more distinct shape, a flattened dome or saucer-like form, with a structure that seemed metallic and solid. A powerful beam of light shot down from its underside, illuminating the roadway and their police cars in a brilliant, sterile white light. It was as bright as day, a sterile, artificial daylight that bleached all color from the world. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, palpable energy. The hum of their police radios dissolved into a roar of static. their connection to the outside world severed. They were alone, isolated in a bubble of alien reality. The object was so close, so real, so undeniably present. Spar, overwhelmed by a mixture of terror and awe, felt an overwhelming urge to get out of his car, to stand directly in the light, to see it with his own eyes without the filter of a windshield. He grabbed his department-issued camera, a simple Polaroid, determined to capture a piece of this impossible reality. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking, and aimed it through the windshield, snapping a picture. Then he opened his door and stepped out into the silent, luminous world. The light was not hot, but it was physically palpable, a pressure on the skin. The silence was the most profound he had ever experienced. There was no wind, no sound of insects, no distant traffic. There was only the immense silent craft hanging above him and the stark, white light it poured down upon the world. He was a man standing on the threshold of a new reality, a witness to a moment that would forever divide his life into a before and an after. In that moment, he was no longer just a police officer from Portage County. He was an emissary of the human race, standing face to face with a mystery as old as the stars themselves. The questions that had burned in his mind during the chase now felt small, insignificant. The only thing that mattered was the immense, silent, and terrifyingly beautiful truth hanging in the sky above him. The moment stretched into an eternity. Bathed in the silent, overwhelming luminescence, Dale Spar and Barney Neff were suspended in a state of pure, primal awe. The world they knew had been completely supplanted by the spectacle hanging in the sky. The object itself was a paradox of form and function. It was clearly a machine, a piece of hardware, its metallic sheen visible even through the intense glow it emitted. Yet it behaved like a living thing, its light pulsing with a slow, rhythmic cadence like a colossal heart beating in the chest of the night. Spore, standing outside his vehicle, raised his Polaroid camera again, desperately trying to capture a definitive image, a piece of irrefutable proof. He snapped another photo, the flash a pathetic, momentary spark against the object's overwhelming brilliance. The air around him felt electric, charged with static, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. The very atmosphere seemed to be altered by the object's presence, bent to its will. From beneath the craft, the beam of light intensified, narrowing its focus directly onto the two police cruisers and the small patch of highway they occupied. It was an act of deliberate, focused attention. They were being observed, studied, scanned. The feeling was not one of overt hostility, but of a cold, clinical curiosity, the way a scientist might examine a specimen under a microscope. This feeling of being scrutinized, of being utterly powerless and exposed, was perhaps more terrifying than any overt threat. They were no longer participants in a chase, they were subjects in an experiment. As Spar stood transfixed, Officer Neff remained in his cruiser, his hand on his revolver, a futile gesture of defiance against a power he could not comprehend. Through his windshield, he watched the light play across the hood of his car, watched as the very molecules of the world seemed to shimmer and vibrate. The silence was broken by a new sound, or rather, the lack of one. The engines of their cars, which had been left idling, sputtered and died in unison. The radios, already swamped with static, went completely dead. Every piece of their technology had been neutralized, silenced by the object's proximity. They were now completely cut off, isolated in a dead zone of their own making, drawn there by this silent celestial magnet. It was in this moment of absolute technological failure that the object made its most profound statement. Its power was not just in its speed or its silence, but in its ability to command the very forces of electromagnetism to simply switch off the human world. As the first hints of dawn began to stain the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and purple, the encounter reached its zenith. The object began to ascend. It did not blast off, it simply rose vertically with the same effortless, silent grace with which it had appeared. The beam of light retracted, pulling back into the craft like a telescope collapsing. As it climbed higher and higher, its own luminosity seemed to diminish, or perhaps it was simply being dwarfed by the growing light of the approaching day. Within seconds, it had become a bright, star-like point in the pale morning sky. And then, With a final, impossibly fast burst of acceleration, it was gone. It did not fly over the horizon. It vanished. In one moment it was there, a distant point of light. In the next, the sky was empty. The silence it left behind was heavier, more profound than the silence that had preceded it. The world rushed back in. The distant sound of a bird, the rustle of wind in the trees, the faint hum of the waking world. Spar and Neff stood in the eerie twilight. The phantom glow of the encounter still burned into their retinas. Their car engines, miraculously, now started without issue. The radios crackled back to life, flooded with the frantic voices of dispatchers and other officers demanding to know what had happened. They were back in the world, but the world was no longer the same. Shaken, disoriented, and profoundly changed, they radioed that the object was gone. They were instructed to wait at their location. Help was on the way. But what kind of help could possibly address what they had just experienced? As they waited, the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the landscape with the familiar, comforting light of a new day. But the light felt different. It felt mundane, ordinary. It could not wash away the memory of the other light, the silent, intelligent, alien light that had just held them captive. In Spar's pocket were two Polaroid pictures. One was a blur of lights and reflections from inside his windshield. The other, taken outside, was fogged and overexposed, a meaningless smear of chemical reactions. The proof he had so desperately sought had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but his own senses, his own memory, and the shared experience of his fellow officers. The encounter was over, but the ordeal was just beginning. The physical chase had ended, but a new, more grueling pursuit was about to commence. The chase for answers, for credibility, and for a return to a sense of normalcy that they now knew could never be fully reclaimed. The arrival of the authority was swift and clinical. Even before the sun had fully risen, while the memory of the impossible light was still fresh and raw in the minds of the officers, the official machinery began to turn. The initial reports, crackling over police radios across 2 states, had triggered alarms far up the chain of command. An event of this magnitude, involving multiple law enforcement witnesses and a sustained pursuit of an unidentified aerial object, could not be ignored. It had tripped a wire within the national security apparatus. The first on the scene were not fellow police officers bringing coffee and reassurance, but stern, tight-lipped men in crisp uniforms. Air Force officers from the greater Pittsburgh airport arrived, their demeanor a stark contrast to the bewildered state of the local cops. They were not there to comfort or to share in the awe. They were there to control the narrative, to contain the breach in consensus reality that had just occurred. The Air Force men, representatives of Project Blue Book, the official and highly controversial U.S. Air Force study of UFOs, immediately took charge. They separated the witnesses. Dale Spar, Barney Neff, Frank Pansanella, and the others were interviewed individually. This is a classic debriefing technique designed to prevent witnesses from reinforcing a shared narrative and to identify inconsistencies in their accounts. The questions were pointed, repetitive, and laced with a subtle, dismissive skepticism. Had they been drinking? Were they tired? Did they know what the planet Venus looked like at dawn? Could it have been a satellite, a weather balloon, an experimental aircraft? Every question was a gentle nudge away from the extraordinary truth of their experience and toward a more palatable, conventional explanation. Spar and Neff, exhausted and still in shock, recounted their story with as much detail as they could muster. They described the object's shape, its impossible speed and maneuverability, its deafening silence, and the intense light that had bathed them. They described the electromagnetic effects on their cars and radios. They told a consistent, detailed story, a story corroborated by multiple other officers. But it was clear from the investigators' tone that their testimony was not being received as fact, but as a problem to be managed. The Air Force men were not there to investigate a phenomenon. They were there to investigate the witnesses. Their job was not to find out what the object was, but to find out what the object wasn't. Dale Spar, the man at the heart of the event, faced the most intense scrutiny. He was the primary witness, the one who had initiated the chase. His character, his service record, his psychological state, everything was now under a microscope. He handed over his Polaroid photos, his only tangible evidence. The officers examined them briefly, their faces betraying no emotion, and then confiscated them. Spar would never see them again. The message was clear. The evidence now belonged to them. The story now belonged to them. As the morning wore on, the official presence grew. The small stretch of Pennsylvania highway became a secured scene. The local police, including Chief Buchert, were politely but firmly sidelined. This was now a federal matter, a matter of national security. The story that had unfolded so dramatically in the public sphere of police radio chatter was now being forced back into the shadows behind the closed doors of official inquiry. The witnesses were instructed not to speak to the press. They were told that the Air Force would conduct a thorough investigation and release its findings in due course. It was a promise of transparency that felt like a threat. They were being asked to surrender their own experience, to defer to the judgment of an authority that had already decided what the answer would be. The archetypal roles were now firmly established. Spar and Neff were the witnesses, ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary circumstance, their perceptions now on trial. The Air Force officers were the authority, a faceless institutional entity whose primary goal was not the discovery of truth, but the maintenance of order and the preservation of a comfortable, predictable worldview. The narrative was being wrested away from those who had lived it. The raw, terrifying, and wondrous event of the night was being processed, sanitized, and prepared for reinterpretation. The official explanation, whatever it would be, was already being drafted in the cold, bureaucratic language of dismissal. For Spar and the other officers, the sense of isolation that began in the dead zone under the object was now being reinforced by the very institutions they served. They had witnessed something profound, something that could change the world, and now they were being told, in no uncertain terms, to be quiet. The mystery of the object in the sky was being eclipsed by a new, more insidious mystery, the mystery of the cover-up that was unfolding around them in the bright, clear light of day. While the gears of the official investigation ground toward a predetermined conclusion, a different kind of inquiry was beginning. The story of the Portage County chase was too big, too public to be completely suppressed. It leaked out, first through police scanners and local gossip, then exploding into the regional and national news. The dramatic headline, "Police Chase Flying Saucer for 85 Miles," was irresistible. It was this public exposure that brought the case to the attention of the investigator. In the world of UFO research in the 1960s, the preeminent civilian organization was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP. Led by retired Marine Corps Major Donald Kehoe, NICAP was a thorn in the side of the Air Force, a persistent, well-organized, and scientifically minded group dedicated to a serious, objective study of the UFO phenomenon. They were the counter-authority, the public's watchdog against official secrecy and dismissal. When news of the Ohio-Pennsylvania chase reached NICAP, it was immediately recognized as a case of major significance. Multiple witnesses, all of them trained law enforcement officers. A long-duration event, extreme physical phenomena, including impossible speeds and electromagnetic effects. This was not a fleeting light in the sky. This was a Class A case, the kind that could not be easily explained away. The investigator assigned to the case was a man named William B. Weitzel, a meticulous and tenacious researcher from the Pittsburgh area. Weitzel was the archetypal investigator, driven not by belief, but by a relentless pursuit of the facts. He understood the Air Force's playbook. He knew that their primary objective was to debunk, to find any plausible-sounding explanation, no matter how improbable, to close the case and reassure the public. Weitzel's investigation ran parallel to the official one, but his methods were entirely different. He didn't seek to intimidate or discredit the witnesses. He sought to understand their experience. He traveled to Portage County and to Conway, Pennsylvania, speaking with Dale Spar, Barney Neff, Frank Panzanella, and the other officers involved. He conducted his interviews not in a sterile official setting, but in their homes, in coffee shops, in places where they felt comfortable enough to speak freely, away from the judgmental gaze of their superiors and the military. He spent hours with them, patiently reconstructing the timeline of the event minute by minute, mile by mile. He had them draw sketches of the object. He went over their reports, comparing their testimonies, noting the remarkable consistency between them. Unlike the Air Force investigators, Weitzel was interested in the details they provided. He noted the description of the object's shape, the inverted ice cream cone, and its metallic texture. He focused on the silence, a detail that immediately ruled out any known aircraft. He paid close attention to the report of the engines and radios failing, a classic feature of close encounter cases known as an electromagnetic effect, or EM effect. Weitzel also expanded the scope of his investigation beyond the police officers. He canvassed the area along the chase route, looking for other potential witnesses. Did anyone else see the object? He found several. A woman who was awake early saw a bright light moving silently across the sky. A farmer reported seeing a strange illumination over his fields. These civilian accounts, while less detailed than the officers', helped to build a web of corroboration. They painted a picture of a large, silent object traversing the pre-dawn sky, seen by multiple people in different locations. This was not a shared hallucination among a few tired cops. This was a real, physical event. The core of Weitzel's work was the creation of a counter-narrative. He was compiling the evidence that he knew the Air Force would ignore or dismiss. He collected the official police reports, the radio logs, and his own extensive interview notes. He created a comprehensive file that documented not just the officer's chase, but the entire context of the event. He was building a case, not for a legal court, but for the court of public opinion and for the historical record. His investigation was a race against the official story. He knew that once Project Blue Book released its findings, the media would largely accept it, and the nuances of the case would be lost. The official explanation would become the official reality. Weitzel's role was to preserve the primary evidence, the raw, unvarnished testimony of the witnesses, before it could be buried under an avalanche of official denial. He was an archivist of the impossible, a defender of the witness against the crushing weight of institutional authority. The file he was compiling was more than just a collection of reports. It was a testament to the courage of the men who had dared to report what they saw, and a damning indictment of the system that was preparing to betray them. Weeks after the chase, the tension and public speculation reached a fever pitch. The officers, especially Dale Spar, were in a state of limbo, their incredible story hanging in the air, awaiting the final verdict from the authority. They had told their truth, a truth corroborated by multiple colleagues, but they were now powerless, their fate and reputation in the hands of Project Blue Book and its enigmatic chief, Major Hector Quintanilla. The verdict, when it finally came, was delivered not with the gravity of a serious investigation, but with the casual wave of a dismissive hand. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation, a textbook example of explaining away the inexplicable. The official explanation from the United States Air Force was twofold and utterly stunning in its absurdity. The object that Deputy Sheriff Dale Spar had first seen rising from the woods, the object that he and Officer Barney Neff had chased for 85 miles, the object that multiple other officers had confirmed seeing, was, according to the Air Force, the planet Venus. And to account for the initial sighting at low altitude, they added a secondary explanation. It was likely confused with light from a communications satellite, possibly Echo 1's, which was in orbit at the time. The Air Force report, penned by Quintanilla himself, suggested that the officers, caught in a state of excitement, had essentially chased a planet across the sky, their perceptions distorted by atmospheric conditions, fatigue, and the power of suggestion. The report made a passing, almost comical reference to the possibility of swamp gas being a factor in some UFO sightings, a phrase that would become a lightning rod for public ridicule and a symbol of official contempt for witnesses. The explanation was not just a dismissal. It was an insult. It was an assault on the intelligence, professionalism, and sanity of every officer involved. Let us analyze the sheer impossibility of this official story. Venus, while bright, is a point of light. The officers described a large, structured, metallic-looking object, shaped like a flattened cone, estimated to be 50 feet in diameter. They saw it at low altitude, initially at treetop level. Venus does not rise from the woods. They chased it for 90 minutes at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. Venus, fixed in the heavens, cannot be chased down a highway. The object they pursued made sharp right-angle turns, hovered silently, and accelerated to incredible speeds. Venus moves with the stately, predictable rotation of the celestial sphere. The object emitted a powerful beam of light that illuminated the ground and caused electromagnetic failure in their vehicles. Venus is a planet millions of miles away. It does not project beams of light or shut down car engines. The Air Force explanation systematically ignored every key detail of the witness testimony. It cherry-picked the single fact that Venus was visible in the pre-dawn sky and stretched it into a narrative so thin it was transparent. The mention of a satellite was equally nonsensical. A satellite appears as a small, fast-moving point of light traveling in a straight, predictable trajectory. It does not hover, it does not pace cars, it does not change direction. The official story was a fiction, a hastily constructed fantasy designed to do one thing: close the case. It was a public relations solution, not a scientific one. The reaction from the witnesses was one of utter disbelief and betrayal. Dale Spar, a man who had served in the Air Force, who knew what planes and planets looked like, was now being told by that same institution that he was incapable of telling the difference between a 50-foot-wide craft hovering over the road and a distant point of light in the sky. It was a form of institutional gaslighting on a grand scale. They were being told that their shared, vivid, terrifying experience had not happened. They had imagined it. The investigator, William Weitzel of NICAP, was outraged but not surprised. This was the exact pattern of behavior he had come to expect from Project Blue Book. His own meticulous file on the case stood in stark contrast to the Air Force's flimsy two-page dismissal. Where he had pages of detailed, consistent testimony, they had a one-paragraph conclusion. Where he had a complex event involving multiple witnesses and extraordinary phenomena, they had a simple misidentification. The Venus explanation became a public joke, but it served its purpose. It provided an official answer, something the media could print. The headline, "Police Chase Venus," was far less threatening to the status quo than "Police Chase Alien Spacecraft." The story began to fade from the headlines, replaced by the next news cycle. The authority had won. They had successfully weathered the storm, not by addressing the phenomenon, but by assassinating the character and credibility of the witnesses. The object itself remained a mystery, but the official file was stamped closed, the truth buried under a lie so blatant, so audacious, that it was almost a confession of the cover-up itself. The message was clear. We will not acknowledge this reality, and we will discredit anyone who says they have seen it. The aftermath of the official explanation was a slow, grinding tragedy for the man at the center of the storm. For Deputy Dale Spar, the end of the chase was the beginning of a personal ordeal that would cost him his career, his reputation, and his peace of mind. The light in the sky vanished, but the shadow it cast would follow him for the rest of his life. He became, almost overnight, a public spectacle. He was the cop who chased a flying saucer. The Air Force's dismissive Venus explanation had opened the floodgates of public ridicule. He was mocked in newspapers, on the radio, and in his own community. People who had once respected him as a symbol of law and order now looked at him with a mixture of pity and scorn. He was no longer a reliable witness, but a crank, a fool who couldn't tell a planet from a spaceship. The ridicule was relentless and deeply personal. He would walk into a diner and conversations would stop, followed by snickers. His children were teased at school. The very community he had sworn to protect now treated him like an outcast. The psychological toll was immense. Spar had witnessed something that shattered his understanding of the world, a traumatic and awe-inspiring event. But instead of receiving support or counseling, he was met with disbelief and mockery. He was forced to constantly defend his own sanity, to relive the most stressful night of his life over and over again for skeptical reporters and jeering neighbors. The experience created a profound sense of isolation. He had shared the event with other officers, but as the primary witness and the one who initiated the pursuit, he bore the brunt of the public's reaction. The professional world he had built his life around began to crumble. Within the Portage County Sheriff's Department, he became a source of embarrassment. His superiors, under pressure to move on from the incident, grew distant. The camaraderie he had once shared with his fellow officers frayed. He was the man who had brought the circus to town, and now the department just wanted the circus to leave. His life became a living paradox. He was famous, but for all the wrong reasons. His name was known across the country, but it was synonymous with delusion. He was invited to speak at UFO conferences, where he was hailed as a hero by believers, but this only served to further alienate him from his professional life and his local community. He was caught between two worlds, the world of believers, which offered him validation but no return to normalcy, and the real world, which offered him a path back to respectability only if he recanted his story and admitted he was wrong. But he could not recant. He could not deny what he had seen. To do so would be to betray his own senses, his own memory, his own truth. He was trapped by his own integrity. He had told the truth, and the truth was destroying him. The constant stress and public humiliation took a toll on his health and his family life. He suffered from anxiety and had trouble sleeping. The image of the silent, luminous object forever burned into his mind. His marriage came under strain. The man who had left for a routine patrol one April evening never truly came home. He was replaced by a haunted, tormented figure, a man forever changed by 90 minutes of impossible reality. Eventually, he could no longer bear the pressure. Dale Spar resigned from the Portage County Sheriff's Department. He left the career he loved, the only life he had ever known. He tried to start over, moving away, taking on different jobs, but the story always followed him. He was, and always would be, the cop who chased a UFO. His story is the archetypal tragedy of the UFO witness. He was an ordinary man who had an extraordinary experience, reported it honestly through the proper channels, and was subsequently punished for it. He was not undone by the object in the sky, but by the reaction of the world on the ground. The authority, in its effort to maintain control and deny the existence of the phenomenon, had made him a casualty, a piece of collateral damage in a war for the truth. His life became a cautionary tale, a stark warning to anyone else who might see something they weren't supposed to see. Speak up, and you risk losing everything. The system will not protect you. It will sacrifice you to protect its own secrets. The Portage County chase did not simply fade into obscurity. While the official explanation succeeded in quelling the mainstream media storm, the case took on a new life in the underground streams of civilian UFO research. The file compiled by William Weitzel and NICAP became a cornerstone of the argument against the Air Force's debunking campaign. It was a meticulously documented account that stood as a permanent public rebuttal to the official narrative of Venus. The case became legendary, a textbook example of a high strangeness, high credibility sighting. It had everything a serious researcher could want: multiple reliable witnesses from law enforcement, a long-duration chase covering a significant distance, corroboration from officers in different jurisdictions and states, reports of extreme and technologically impossible maneuvers, and finally, the classic electromagnetic effects that suggested a powerful advanced energy source. In the decades that followed, the Portage County case would be cited in countless books, articles, and documentaries about the UFO phenomenon. It became a symbol of the great disconnect between witness testimony and official explanation. It served as a powerful illustration of the lengths to which governmental bodies would go to control public perception of this baffling and potentially world-changing subject. The legacy of the case is a complex one. For the public at large, it remains a curious footnote, a bizarre story of some cops who chased a planet. But for those who have taken the time to look deeper, it is something far more profound. It is a mystery that has never been solved. The central questions remain as potent and unanswered today as they were in 1966. What was the object that Dale Spar and his fellow officers pursued across Ohio and into Pennsylvania? The Venus explanation is so patently absurd that it can be dismissed out of hand. It was not a planet, it was not a satellite, it was not a weather balloon or any known conventional aircraft. The witnesses, men trained to observe and identify, were clear on this point. So, what was it? Was it an experimental military craft, a secret project from a hidden hangar, so advanced that its existence had to be denied even to local law enforcement? This is a plausible theory, and one that is often invoked to explain such sightings. It would account for the advanced technology and the subsequent cover-up. But it struggles to explain the sheer audacity of the event, parading a top-secret vehicle in plain sight for 90 minutes, interacting with police cars and drawing massive attention to itself. It seems a reckless and counterintuitive way to test a secret prototype. Or was it something else? Was it what the witnesses believed it to be, a craft not of this world, a vehicle piloted by a non-human intelligence? This is the extraordinary claim, the one that requires extraordinary evidence. Yet, when confronted with the detailed, consistent testimony of 7 police officers, one must ask, what level of evidence is required? If the sworn testimony of multiple lawmen is insufficient, then what would be? The second great question is, why the cover-up? Why did the Air Force feel the need to issue such a clumsy, transparently false explanation? Why ridicule and discredit decorated police officers instead of conducting a genuine, open-minded investigation? The answer to this question may be more unsettling than the answer to the first. Perhaps the authority knew or suspected what the object was. Perhaps the truth was so disruptive, so challenging to our understanding of science, religion, and our place in the cosmos, that it was deemed too dangerous for public consumption. In this view, the cover-up was not an act of ignorance, but an act of protection, or control. They were protecting the public from a truth they believed it could not handle. Or, more cynically, they were protecting their own authority, unwilling to admit that there are forces in this universe that are beyond their control and comprehension. The story of the Portage County chase, therefore, leaves us adrift in a sea of profound uncertainty. It is a case file that remains stubbornly open. It forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. It suggests that the reality we inhabit is more complex, more mysterious, and perhaps more populated than we are led to believe. And it reveals that the institutions we trust to inform and protect us may, in fact, be the gatekeepers of a truth they have decided we are not worthy to know. The final image of the case is not of a flying saucer, but of Dale Spar, a man broken by the truth. His personal tragedy serves as the human cost of this great cosmic secret. The mystery is not just out there in the sky. It is in here, in the heart of our society, in the conflict between what is seen and what is permitted to be said. The case of the police officer who chased a UFO down a country highway is more than just a strange tale. It is a mirror reflecting our deepest questions about the universe and our most troubling doubts about the nature of power and truth here on Earth.